There comes a moment in every empath's life when they finally see themselves clearly, not through the distorted mirror held up by an avoidant partner, not through the guilt they've been conditioned to carry, but through their own power, clarity, and truth. That moment is the wake-up call. And for the avoidant, it's the moment they realize the person they believed would always be there for them suddenly isn't. A super empath doesn't rise because they're soft. They rise because they've spent years learning how to love deeply, support endlessly, and understand intuitively. But that strength, when it's taken for granted, doesn't shrink. It evolves, it sharpens, it becomes self-respect with a heartbeat. Avoidant partners often run not from the person in front of them, but from the feelings inside them. They fear closeness because closeness demands vulnerability. It demands accountability. It demands that they step up instead of shut down. And for a long time, you, the super empath, allowed the gaps. You filled the silence, you forgave the distance, you explained away the confusion. You believed that if you just loved a little harder, a little cleaner, a little more patiently, the avoidant would finally meet you where you stood. But here's the final wake-up call. A super empath's love is not an emotional crutch. It's a privilege. And once they recognize that, everything changes. The avoidant is used to walking away first. They expect you to chase. They expect you to soothe the wound they created. They expect you to carry the emotional weight for both of you. But one day, without drama, without revenge, without shouting, you stop. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring for yourself. And that shift, that's the moment the avoidant feels something they never expected. Loss. Not the loss of attention, not the loss of convenience, but the loss of someone who actually saw them, cared for them, supported them, and loved them in a way they may never experience again. A super empath doesn't leave to punish. They leave because they finally understand that their heart is not a home for someone who refuses to stay. They leave because peace feels better than emotional chaos. They leave because self-worth finally speaks louder than fear of being alone. And the avoidant? They are left with the echo of everything they ran from. The empath's absence is louder than their presence. Their silence speaks truths the avoidant never let them say. Their detachment becomes the lesson the avoidant never wanted, but desperately needed. This isn't about revenge. This is about evolution. Your evolution. You were never too much. You were never the problem. You were simply offering a love that someone wasn't brave enough to receive. And now you're offering that same love to yourself. The avoidant may wake up and realize what they lost, but by then you will have already stepped into a life where your emotional availability is met, your love is valued, and your heart is finally understood. Because the final wake-up call isn't for them. It's for you. A super empath's power doesn't arrive suddenly or dramatically. It's a quiet evolution that happens over time through moments of confusion, moments of heartbreak, and moments of deep self-reflection that slowly push them toward a truth they once avoided. They have always been the strongest one in the room, even when they didn't feel like it. For so long, the empath measures their worth through what they give, how much they support, how deeply they love, and how tirelessly they show up for others. They assume that love is proven by sacrifice, that patience is a sign of loyalty, and that understanding someone's wounds is the same as healing them. But eventually their emotional generosity starts to feel like a burden instead of a gift, especially when it is taken for granted by someone who can't meet them with the same effort. That discomfort becomes the first spark of awakening. The super empath begins to realize that constantly explaining, justifying, or forgiving isn't love. It's abandonment of self. They start to notice how much they shrink to make the relationship function, how often they silence their needs to avoid triggering the avoidance fears, and how much energy they expend trying to keep a bond alive while the other person keeps stepping back. Slowly, the empath recognizes that their capacity to understand others is a strength, but their tendency to ignore themselves is a wound. This recognition is powerful because it shifts the focus inward. Instead of asking, how can I make this work? They start asking, is this even good for me? When an empath sees their worth, they stop negotiating with behavior that makes them feel small. They stop accepting emotional breadcrumbs in the hope that consistency will eventually arrive. They stop settling for words that are not backed by action. What once felt like love begins to feel like depletion, and the empath realizes they are pouring into someone who rarely pours back. This awakening doesn't make them cold, it makes them clear. It gives them the courage to step away from dynamics where they do all the emotional heavy lifting. It gives them the strength to break the pattern of overgiving, over-explaining, and overextending themselves. As their self-worth grows, the emotional fog lifts. They understand that empathy does not require endurance of emotional neglect. They see that their tenderness is not a weakness, but a profound ability to connect, one that deserves to be met by someone capable of reciprocating, not just receiving. They come to accept that the love they carry is rare, beautiful, and deeply valuable, and that offering it to someone who cannot appreciate it is like pouring water into a cup with holes. The awakening of the super empath is not a moment of anger, but a moment of clarity. It is the realization that their worth is not determined by how much they withstand, but by how much they honor their own heart. And once they fully understand that, the need to chase validation, fix emotional distance, or hold the relationship together disappears. They no longer view themselves through the lens of the avoidant's fears, but through their own truth. They are powerful, deserving, and capable of love that is returned with equal depth. Avoidant individuals often move through relationships carrying a quiet storm inside them, one that the super empath tries to soothe without ever fully understanding its roots. The avoidant doesn't pull away because the empath is too emotional, too loving, or too demanding. They pull away because connection itself feels like a threat to their internal equilibrium. When someone gets close, it triggers deep-seated fears that have nothing to do with the person reaching out and everything to do with the avoidant's past experiences, unresolved wounds, and unexpressed feelings. The super empath often mistakes this distance as a reflection of their inadequacy, not realizing that what they are actually witnessing is the avoidant's struggle with vulnerability. Avoidants have learned to survive by shutting down emotionally. Somewhere along the way, closeness became associated with loss of control, disappointment, or pain. So when a super empath offers genuine love, presence, and emotional depth, the avoidant feels exposed rather than comforted. The empath's warmth illuminates areas inside the avoidant they have spent years ignoring. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. Instead of leaning in, they retreat. Instead of opening up, they withdraw. The empath believes their consistency will bridge the gap, but the avoidant interprets that dedication as pressure. Not because the empath is doing anything wrong, but because the avoidant has not yet learned how to stay in a space where emotions are real and intimacy is stable. This dynamic creates confusion. The super empath senses the avoidant's need for connection beneath the surface, the way they soften in rare vulnerable moments, the way they seek closeness only to quickly pull back again. The empath sees the potential and the truth behind the avoidant's walls, which makes them hold on even tighter. But the avoidant's fear grows proportionally to the closeness being offered. They fear they will disappoint the empath. They fear they will lose themselves. They fear they will be seen fully and judged. Awareness of their internal conflict often drives them to act cold, detached, or emotionally unavailable even when the desire for connection is present. The avoidant often assumes that distance protects them. They believe that stepping back prevents conflict or emotional overwhelm. Yet, what they are truly running from isn't the empath. It's the vulnerability required to build a meaningful bond. The empath inadvertently becomes a mirror reflecting emotions the avoidant refuses to face. This creates a cycle where the empath tries harder to make the avoidant feel safe, while the avoidant pulls away to feel safe themselves. Both want connection, but only one is emotionally equipped to handle it. Understanding this is not about excusing unhealthy behavior, but about revealing the truth. Avoidants are not rejecting the empath, they are rejecting the discomfort of intimacy itself. This awareness helps the super empath recognize that they were never the problem. They were simply offering a level of closeness the avoidant was unprepared to handle. The empath's warmth didn't scare the avoidant because it was wrong. It scared them because it was real. And real connection requires emotional bravery the avoidant hasn't yet developed. The moment a super empath stops chasing is not born from anger, revenge, or bitterness. It's born from a quiet, life-altering realization that their self-respect is worth more than the uncertainty and emotional imbalance they've been enduring. For a long time, the empath truly believes they can love the relationship into safety. They think if they remain patient enough, gentle enough, understanding enough, the avoidant will eventually feel secure enough to show up fully. The empath interprets the avoidant's distance as something that can be fixed with more nurturing. But over time, the weight of always being the one who reaches out, the one who clears misunderstandings, the one who softens conflict, begins to feel heavier than the connection itself. Something within them begins to shift. What starts this shift is often subtle. It's the moment the empath realizes they haven't felt emotionally supported in a long time. It's the moment they catch themselves apologizing for needs that should be normal in any healthy relationship. Consistency, communication, affection, respect. It's the moment they hear themselves making excuses for behavior that would break someone else's heart. And for the first time, the empath sees how much effort they have poured in just to feel almost enough. This is where self-respect begins to awaken. It doesn't roar, it whispers, but that whisper is powerful enough to change everything. Self-respect teaches the empath to pause, not pursue. It creates space for clarity to enter. Clarity that shows them how much they've compromised themselves to maintain a connection that does not reciprocate their emotional labor. Instead of feeling desperate to fix the distance, the empath begins to observe it. They start asking questions they previously avoided. Why am I the only one trying? Why does love feel like waiting? Why do I ignore my own emotional hunger while feeding someone else's fears? These questions are the beginning of emotional liberation. As the empath prioritizes self-respect, their behavior naturally changes. They stop initiating every conversation. They stop over-explaining their feelings. They stop bending their boundaries to keep the peace. They stop shrinking themselves to prevent discomfort. And this withdrawal isn't cold, it's healthy. It's the reclaiming of energy that was once constantly poured into someone who rarely gave back. The empath no longer feels compelled to chase reassurance or validate the relationship through relentless effort. Instead, they allow the space to reveal the truth of the connection. The avoidant, who was once accustomed to being pursued, begins to notice the absence of the empath's emotional presence. But the empath isn't pulling away to provoke a reaction. They're simply choosing themselves after a long season of choosing someone who wasn't ready. The peace they feel from stepping back becomes more fulfilling than the anxiety they felt from holding on. Prioritizing self-respect transforms the empath from someone who begs for emotional crumbs into someone who recognizes they deserve a full meal. This shift is the quiet turning point. When the empath finally understands that loving someone should never cost them their dignity, and once that truth is embraced, the chase ends forever. The avoidant often moves through relationships believing they have endless time, endless chances, and endless access to the person who loves them. They're accustomed to the rhythm, they pull away, the empath comes closer, they go silent, the empath reaches out, they create distance, the empath fills it. This cycle becomes predictable, almost comforting, because it allows the avoidant to maintain emotional control without ever having to confront the deeper fears that make intimacy feel overwhelming. They assume the empath will always be there, always understanding, always patient. But when the super empath finally walks away, not in anger, not in theatrics, but in calm certainty, it sends a shock through the avoidance world that they never anticipated. What makes the empath's departure so powerful is the silence that follows. The avoidant expects emotional intensity, tears, explanations, maybe even arguments. They expect the empath to fight for the connection one last time, but instead they are met with stillness. That stillness forces them into a confrontation not with the empath, but with themselves. For the first time, the avoidant feels the weight of what the empath carried for both of them, the emotional labor, the communication, the forgiveness, the understanding. And in that silence, the avoidant realizes something devastating. The presence they always took for granted has turned into an absence they can no longer escape. Avoidants don't usually understand what they had until it's gone. Not because they lacked caring, but because emotional closeness is something they struggle to process in real time. When the empath was present, the avoidant felt overwhelmed by the demands of vulnerability. But once the empath leaves, the avoidant feels the emptiness of that absence with startling clarity. They remember moments when the empath tried to connect, moments when the empath offered love gently and consistently, moments when the empath asked for nothing but honesty and partnership. These memories become more vivid once the empath is no longer there, because now there is nothing to distract the avoidant from seeing the truth. The loss isn't about losing attention. It's deeper. The avoidant realizes they have lost the one person who truly understood them without judgment. They have lost the emotional anchor that kept the relationship steady. They have lost the warmth that softened their edges, the patience that supported their fears, and the love that accepted them even when they couldn't fully accept themselves. This is when the regret settles in. Not because the empath left dramatically, but because the empath left with dignity, leaving no emotional chaos behind. That quiet departure is what stings the most. For the avoidant, the empath's absence becomes the catalyst for reflection. The space reveals everything the avoidant refused to acknowledge. The relationship wasn't one-sided because the empath gave too much, but because the avoidant gave too little. This realization arrives slowly, sometimes painfully, as the avoidant recognizes that the connection they feared, fully embracing, is the very connection they now miss. And in that moment of clarity, they understand that the empath's love was never the problem. Their own walls were. The final wake-up call is rarely the moment the avoidant regrets losing the empath. It's the moment the super empath realizes they no longer need the avoidant's validation to feel whole. For so long, the empath believed that the story would only feel complete when the avoidant finally understood their mistakes, acknowledged their distance, or expressed remorse for the emotional imbalance. But as the empath grows, heals, and reconnects with themselves, they discover that their transformation is far more powerful than any apology the avoidant could ever give. The real evolution happens within the empath, not within the avoidant's sudden clarity. There comes a turning point when the empath starts noticing how peaceful life feels without the constant emotional unpredictability. They realize that their heart isn't racing with worry anymore, that they're sleeping better, laughing louder, and thinking more clearly. The emotional tension that once felt normal is now revealed as the discomfort it truly was. They understand that loving someone shouldn't feel like survival. It shouldn't require deciphering mixed signals, managing silence, or shrinking their voice to maintain the connection. And with this clarity, the empath steps into a new version of themselves, one that isn't driven by fear of abandonment, but by love for their own well-being. As they evolve, the empath sees the relationship's truth through a new lens. They recognize their own patterns, overgiving, over-explaining, hoping too hard, and accepting too little. But instead of feeling shame, they feel empowered. Their past behaviors make sense in the context of someone who was trying to love deeply in an environment that could not sustain depth. This understanding frees them. It helps them reclaim their power without needing closure from the very person who couldn't give them emotional stability. The empath finally understands that their healing was always an internal process, not something the avoidant could contribute to or interrupt. Meanwhile, the avoidant's regret becomes a distant echo, not the center of the story. Even if the avoidant wakes up one day and realizes the magnitude of what they lost, the empath no longer depends on that recognition to move forward. The avoidant may replay moments in their mind, remembering the care they once received and the love they couldn't step into. But that reflection belongs to them, not the empath. It is their lesson, their awakening, their consequence. The empath has already outgrown the chapter where that regret might have mattered. What truly defines this final keynote is the understanding that the empath's journey isn't about proving their worth to someone who couldn't see it. It's about becoming someone who no longer tolerates emotional inconsistency or relational ambiguity. Their heart becomes wiser, their boundaries become stronger, and their self-love becomes non-negotiable. They attract relationships that match their depth instead of draining it. They choose partners capable of showing up instead of shutting down. They realize that their emotional capacity is a gift that deserves protection, not exploitation. In the end, the empath's transformation is the real victory. It is the moment they stop waiting for the avoidant to evolve and start embracing their own growth. The story shifts from heartbreak to empowerment, from longing to liberation, and in this new chapter, the empath finally sees that they were never waiting for the avoidant to understand them. They were waiting for themselves to awaken. And so, as we close this message, remember that the true victory of the super empath is not in being understood by the avoidant, but in finally understanding themselves, recognizing their worth, reclaiming their power, and choosing a life where their love is met with equal presence and emotional courage. Your journey is not defined by who couldn't meet you, but by who you became when you stopped abandoning yourself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for showing up for your own healing. And thank you for having the courage to step into the strongest, clearest, most self-honoring version of you.